you hear me? Thank you very much for coming this morning bright and early to join our debate. The moral question, is there a place for private in education? I will be your moderator this morning. My name is Loulwa Bakr from Saudi Arabia. And together this morning, we have a distinguished panel that will help us shed some light or answer the question, do you think private should be in education or shouldn't be? I will start by introducing the topic. The private sector's involvement in education has been a controversial question in many countries for a while. In his recently published book, Finnish Lessons, What Can the World Learn from the Educational Change in Finland, Pasi Sahlberg argues against the presence of the private sector in education, citing that the presence of private sector in education is against the very fundamental of equity and equality, which the reformed education system in Finland is based on. On the other hand, the proponents of private sector in education cite that the education sector is chronically underfunded and requires involvement from investment that brings an attitude of innovation, focus, and results, focus on results and return on investment that's desperately needed. So in other places in the world, other than Finland, you see the trend of private schools increasing, schools run for profit, fees and tuitions rivaling that of Ivy League schools, and so forth. So the question is, if education is a public good, is there a place of private and a role for the private sector in education? Please join me together welcoming our distinguished panel. I'll start with His Excellency, Mr. James Mancham, the former president of the Seychelles. Geoffrey Canada, president of the Harlem's Children's Zone in the US. Mr. John Banks, a senior advisor to the Secretary General of Education International in the US. Last but not least, Mr. J. Kimmelman, co-founder and CEO of Bridge International Academies in Kenya. I'll start by asking a round of questions that would allow us to ascertain where each speaker stands within the realm of, are you for or against private sector in the education? So, I'll start with Your Excellency. Your Excellency, what is your view on the subject from the perspective of building an education system in a small emerging country like the Seychelles?
I can only utilize my own experience to come up in favor of private education. Traditionally, when we were a British colony, we had public education alongside private education. Most of the private education fell under the auspices of the religions of the churches. Now, after the coup d'etat in 1976, the men who became very leftist went over to Cuba, Mr. Reedy, and then was introduced to the National Youth Service of Cuba. And when he returned, he, so to speak, nationalized all the private schools, and he went into the realm of public education. Now, was it public education or was it public indoctrination? That's one big question when we tend to ask this against the assumption that all nations are run in a very democratic fashion. So that's one first point. What sort of a regime do you have? So it came to pass that after 16 years of life in exile, when I returned to Seychelles in 1993, one of the main unhappiness of the people was to do with education. That state education, that everybody had got to go to the National Youth Service and get a mediocre education, had prejudice and had influenced the mind of all the people. They were all against. So that after we went into transformation, a new constitution, the Constitution of the Third Republic, today in our constitution, proviso is made to accept private education and to encourage private education. Private education creates competition so that if you want people to come to your school, you've got to give quality education. And this by itself brings a motivation for a higher level of education. And as I said, we've got this experience, and today we have private education thriving. And we found out when our education takes us to advanced level, and we normally have our papers examined in Oxford or Cambridge, and we find that the students who are going to private education school have a far higher level of passes, far much better grade than those going to state education.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So 1 for private education, 0 for public education. Moving on to, I'm keeping score. Moving on to Mr. Geoffrey Canada. Geoffrey, from your extensive and very celebrated experience in providing education in a society that is more and more suffering from disparity in socioeconomic statuses, especially in an advanced country like the US. Can you give us your stand?
Yeah, so, and for the US, and I think to some degree internationally, the questions are a little false because there's always been private education if you have money. Now, I have to raise a lot of money, which means I have to spend a lot of time around wealthy people. It's a problem. I've tried raising money around poor people. It didn't work so well. And this is what I noticed. This is what I know. And I will tell you that every parent feels exactly the same way that I feel. I want the best education for my child. This is not politics. This is my own child. I want them to get a great education, and I will sacrifice anything to give that child a great education. Wealthy people have options. Poor people have no options. Whether your school is horrible, if you are poor, you must send your child to that school. I think that those of us who love public education, because this sounds a little contradictory, I have worked in the public education. Most of my kids in the Harlem Children's Zone are in regular, traditional public schools. My own children have all gone to public schools. I went to public schools. This is not an indictment against the concept of public education. It's an indictment against failure, which people refuse to correct. So if you have a history of failure that goes on for decades, and you see no ability to do any innovation, you see no ability to begin to try to change that system so that it educates kids, I think the option of having private education is absolutely critical for poor people. And I really think that it's a shame that we know young people who will not get an education, and yet we will do nothing about it. In the U.S., so maybe some of these may not translate, I'm a big advocate for charter schools, right? It's a state charter that allows you to get public dollars to educate the kid, and that's very controversial in the States. I think that what we found is that lots of these schools, these charter schools, are able to get higher outcomes with young people than the traditional public schools. Some of them are not, and they ought to be closed, and sometimes they are closed. That is different than the voucher system, right, which folks have advocated for, and I was not a big fan of vouchers for this reason. During the 50s and the 60s, when the schools began to be desegregated in the US, a lot of folks who did not want to integrate their schools, they didn't want to send white kids to school with black kids, were opting out to try and get public dollars to send their kids to really segregated schools. And I've been opposed to that and against that, and sometimes folks, I think, conflate the two issues, vouchers as well as charters. My sense is that we cannot set up a system that allows us to sort of reinforce some of those challenges that we faced early. So while I support public schools, while most of my kids are in public schools and the Harlem Children's Zone, I'm an avid advocate for the option for parents to have choices, and I agree with His Excellency around competition. The failure of competition, when you have no choice, when you have a monopoly, you have no choice. I think that we've got to bring choice into this system to just try some new things.
Fantastic. I'm going to move to Jay, and I'm going to ask you to give me your opinion, because it seems to me that from your life experience or your career experience that you're probably straddling both worlds, being a private education provider to some of the poorest students in Africa. So how does that come into your...
Sure. So I fundamentally believe in a right to education. And I think that governments should, through progressive tax system, fund a world-class quality free education for everyone, including everyone who lives in poverty. But we also have to look at the realities of today. And for the 800 million children that live on less than $2 a day, including places where I work in Kenya and Uganda and Nigeria, that's not the case. They don't have access to a quality education that is either free or provides them with opportunities to truly, for their children to excel. And so I think we then have to look at really the moral question in a different way, which is, I think it's fundamentally immoral to then say, hey, we should wait for this generation or for the next generation to see if we can provide this world-class quality free education. And while we wait and debate the ideology around it, let's let these generations of children sort of be left behind. I think that's in some ways the fundamental immoral sort of position, is that we have to do something today. And we have to provide, to my colleagues over here, choice to all families, right? And in many ways, I think it's an interesting debate that most people, when they look at private education for the wealthy, if you're able to afford a world-class school that might cost you $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, most people don't think about that as a moral question. But when you get to families or children who live in poverty, there seems to be now an ideology around it. Should we allow children in poverty to go to private school? I think that the real question is, we should allow choice, and we should not prevent children who live in poverty from having the same choices as those families who happen to be born with money. And so for me, the real fundamental question is about giving choice to everyone, including children who live in poverty and their families. And if you frame it in that way, I think the moral question becomes a lot clearer, which is, we need to do something today. If that's about fixing the public schools, great. If that's about providing private alternatives, great. Frankly, both should exist, even as we move towards the world, which I think most of us would like, which is a fundamentally world-class free education for everyone. But until we're at that point, we need to provide choice and options for everyone, regardless of their level of income.
So far, 3-0.
John.
John, you've spent an entire career representing teachers, teacher unions, teachers' interests. Can you bring us the perspective of where would teachers stand in the moral question?
Yeah, and I'm glad you said the moral question, because as I said yesterday, I believe in answering the examination question. I think the moral question is education itself and equal entitlement. I mean, Geoffrey said the same thing, actually. And I just want to reflect on something. I was involved in some research in England called the Primary Education Review, and one of its best investigations was into what children thought of their schools. They thought of their schools as profoundly optimistic communities, and their local environments as becoming increasingly dangerous, so that actually schools were becoming more and more important to children and their parents than they had in the past, because that's where you made your friends, and that's where you got your optimism from the future. So actually, the issue is that schools are actually one of the last moral institutions in society. And in fact, what teachers do right the way through the day is make moral judgments all the time in relation to right and wrong. That's how you organize your class, that's how you intervene, etc., etc. So that's a test. And I don't think anyone could deny that communities will be immeasurably impoverished if the moral institution of the community, i.e. the school, is removed. Some villages actually die after their schools have gone, for example. So that's one test. So can the private sector meet that community test is a very important question. And then there's the issue of equality of access. And I just wanted to say something about choice. Everything I've come across in terms of parents I've met over the years, teachers I've met over the years, actually choice is not the top priority. The top priority is that parents want a good local school for their child. Choice comes in if you are anxious about your local school. Mm-hmm. That's the issue. Mm-hmm. It's not a moral imperative choice. The moral imperative is that you want a good local school. So that's the next bit. And then there's the issue of the state itself. The state is the organization of society for the public good. It's a profoundly moral institution. And the question then is education, and I believe it is, the glue of society, that is profoundly moral as well. And therefore, the state has a profound involvement in the running of education. So there are three questions here, it seems to me. Is the private sector's involvement necessary if the state can't provide? And that is a very interesting question, actually, which I'd really like to explore later on. Or is it there as a kind of backup, and that you outsource if the quality of public education is no good? Or, and there are libertarians, I wish James Tooley was here, actually. I think he's doing something else at exactly the same time, actually. But he believes that actually the private sector, as a matter of principle, is a better moral good than the public sector. So there is a separate debate there. I don't believe that, but let's see how far this debate goes. So I believe that education is a public good. Education, therefore, should be a public service. Actually, the private sector's relationship has to meet certain tests, including equality of access, fair admissions, fair funding, etc., etc. And I'd finish by saying that actually there's some very interesting issues about the role of global companies. Those companies who are offering information technology, for example. I know that the OECD, for example, is looking at holding a conference in the autumn on the role of and the relationship of schools to information technology companies. And those countries that have highly devolved systems are finding that some information technology companies are offering services, highly expensive services to schools, and the state worries about whether or not those services are appropriate and whether or not principals are being inveigled into buying highly expensive systems because of the marketing, when actually they turn out to be inappropriate. Now, there's an important debate about what are the protocols that you apply, what protocols does the state apply to information technology companies. That's an example of the kind of debate that you have against the moral tests. What kind of principles do information technology companies use? So I profoundly believe in education being a public good, a public service, and the relationship of the private sector to that is that it must meet moral tests.
Great. Finally, somebody defending the position. Um, Your Excellency, question for you here. Can profit be trusted as a motivation for an educational institution?
When you speak about profit, you immediately brings up the question of quality teachers, cost of quality teachers. I believe profit motive is there. Even in the public sector, you'll only be able to attract the best, provided they're well paid. So there is, in this respect, certain profit for the teachers. And after hearing our respective colleagues speaking, I am reminded of a factor, for example, in Seychelles, where we had two languages traditionally, French and English, and for populist reason, the dictatorship introduced Creole as a language. So the child now is confronted because we speak three national languages, French, English, and Creole. And there's a lot of families, for example, who take the view that in today's day and age where children has got to catch up with new technology, that the requirement of them going to study Creole grammar in a language where there is no reference book whatsoever, and you leave Seychelles, whereas you go, if you got Creole, maybe 90 somewhere, and that's not very promising. So is there not a choice, for example, for the family to want to avoid and to give the child the opportunity of going to go to school of French or English, and at the same time spend the time they would have wasted in learning Creole, in learning mathematics, in learning things to make them cope with the requirement of the modern age of technology?
Right. Although I would beg to differ. Some people do consider properly learning an indigenous language an intrinsic part of maintaining the culture from generation to generation, and I bet that's what the proponents of the Creole language are.
We have always spoken Creole. We will always speak Creole. We will always sing in Creole. We will always make our speeches, political speeches in Creole. But that's a different thing from the need to go and study a grammar which never existed, which is the product of only a few years back. So what do we see in practice today? The only news item in the national newspaper, which is written in Creole, as a news item which the people in control doesn't want the outsiders to read too much about.
That's an interesting one. I apologize for the digression. I will go back to Jay. And Jay, similarly, I come from a financial background, and there's been a lot of talk recently about, even in curriculums and business schools, about changing the term shareholder value that's been a revered, and the holy grail, basically, in business, to stakeholder value. Now, do you believe that the same applies to the education sector? And who would be your stakeholders, and what is the value that needs to come back to them?
Sure. And just to first comment on the question you asked my colleague about profit, I think one thing we should think about is neither for-profit nor state-funded should be trusted. We should be measured, right? This is about outcomes, right? We should be looking at how well are pupils performing. And we don't trust motives, we trust outcomes, right? And I think when you reframe it as focusing on the outcomes, then the particular structure of the entity providing the education becomes secondary to actually measuring whether we're making progress. In terms of stakeholders, obviously my organization focuses on parents. So we have 120,000 pupils and 120,000 parents across our 400 schools. And so our primary stakeholder are the parents and their children. And so everything we do is about making sure that we're delivering value for them. Obviously, there are other stakeholders in the community, whether that be the local government, and et cetera. But fundamentally, at the end of the day, my organization and any other good school provider is looking at the child and their parents as the prime stakeholder. From a business standpoint, of course, they are also the customer, but they're the beneficiary as well. And so in our world, it's the combination. The customer and the beneficiary are the same.
Right. Interesting. Geoffrey, I started this morning by citing an example of Finland, of Finnish school education, and another extreme example, perhaps in the US, and the thriving of the private sector in the education. The question for you is, how do cultural and moral attitudes towards the private sector involvement in education vary across the world, across different countries, across different cultures?
Yeah, you know, I think that the issue that we should be really focused on is whether or not parents feel like they have a voice in their child's education. So let me just say this issue about profit. Profit can't be trusted, but I agree, nobody can be trusted, right? That in the end, you could have a private system. We have a huge problem with a certain group of for-profit colleges in the United States that don't deliver an education for their kids. They're basically mills that people come in, collect their money, they flunk out, and so people have recognized and have said that the government should withdraw funding for those institutions that have lousy data. So I don't think this is a matter of should we trust anybody, but it is a matter that for lots of folk, the data is unmistakable. There was just a series of articles being published by the Daily News, and they're looking at the crisis in New York City. 50,000 children. Clear, they're getting no education at all. It's just unimaginable. At the same time, we put in some evaluation systems with a huge fight to get evaluation system of teachers to figure out which teachers were doing a great job. 150,000 teachers, you couldn't imagine how many were fired for lousy performance. Remember, 50,000 failing kids, one teacher. The math doesn't work, right? So you got a real problem. That is not accountability, right? You've got a clear set of data that shows you that for these kids, they're getting no education whatsoever. So I don't care if it was private schools, I would be outraged. If that was a private system, for-profit system, I would be outraged. I'd be like, how dare you give public money for a system that's failing kids with no accountability? What's the difference that it's a public system when the outcomes are the same? Does a public system mean that you can therefore say these kids don't deserve an education and we're going to turn a blind eye to it? I don't think so. I think this is about creating choice. Here's the other choice issue. To run a charter school, because they want you to deal with fairness, and there are all kinds of ways to game the system, and I'm not going to try and defend all of the folks who don't play by the rules, you have to have a lottery system where people can just go and you pull out a kid's number so you can't sort of stack the deck in one place or the other. It happens sometimes. People still figure out how to game the system. There are a million parents on a waiting list. That should say something about what parents think about the education. 1 million parents on the waiting list to try, because there are not enough seats. If there were no public education in the US, I would be sitting here yelling and screaming for a public education system because I think you've got to have a real competition in this, and parents have to have choices. Right now, we have a system that does not allow for what I would consider to be the supply to meet the demand of what parents have. There's lots of parents that want their traditional public schools. Try to close one and see what happens. People go crazy. Folks will fight for that. There's nothing wrong with that. But at the same time, parents and this is all about class, what social class you are in. Parents of very poor kids often have no choice. And therefore, I think we have a fundamental right to fight to make sure those parents have choices.
John.
Yeah.
Just a rebuttal on that one, please. I don't want to talk too much economics, but can we build a private education sector to plug in the shortage in supply?
Well, let's just talk about the private education sector and private schools. I mean, all the evidence from the OECD is that when you strip out the issue of social class, and I'm glad social class has come up, actually publicly provided schools and private schools perform equally well. There is no virtue in terms of performance in relation to private schools. It's the quality of the leadership and the quality of the teachers and the relationship of the school to the community that counts, not whether it's private or public. That's the OECD evidence. Now, I just want to pick up one or two other things, actually, and I apologize. When I started at EI, I gave myself a kind of vow, really, that I wouldn't talk about my own country. But I will now, so you'll just have to talk. I mean, Geoffrey's been doing it about the US, so I'm going to do it about England,
fair.
actually.
It's only fair.
We have a quasi-market that's been encouraged by the current coalition government in England. And my criticism of the quasi-market is not so much what the designation of the individual schools is, free schools, academies, etc., is that the coalition has smashed up the education system. That actually it is impossible for individual schools and individual communities to actually share knowledge nationally across the system. I mean, actually, to the credit of the Times Educational Supplement, it seems to be substituting because actually teachers are able to use their website to share practice. But the reality of this, of the situation is that you now have in a quasi-market schools, when they innovate, actually saying, we will only share our innovations if you, the next school, pay for it. Not that there's a free exchange of information, knowledge, expertise, innovations in pedagogy, but you have to pay for it. And in fact, the sharpest schools are making shed loads of money actually selling their innovations. That, for me, actually is not the advantage of the market, it's the disadvantage. In a public education system, you have a free exchange of knowledge, and that can be only good, to use the moral question, for the public good of the country. So I think that's a major issue. I think on the issue, and I'm glad Geoffrey brought this up, on the issue of social class. I mean, one of the things, I have these arguments with my colleagues across the world about the nature of the Programme for International Student Assessment, but basically why I think the programme is important is because it's founded on the basis of equity. No country can do its best unless it actually meets the needs of all its children and young people, and actually they can achieve to the highest level. And actually it's using and applying knowledge, which is the basis of the assessments. Now the reality is that if you find that the massive divisions, and there are massive divisions but in terms of social class, the US is a classic example. We've had this conversation, Geoffrey, the social gap between the rich and poor in the US is massive. It's getting bigger, not smaller in the UK. Is what kind of systems do you can only do that on a systemic level. You can only do that on a plan level. You can't leave it to the market to solve the issue of the social gap. You have to have social policy to do it. Now, as I say, what is the relationship of the private sector to that? There may well be a relationship, particularly in services. The key question is what's appropriate.
I'll take it over to Jay. And following up from Geoffrey and John's thoughts. Now, it's one thing when you talk about the private sector providing education where there is no education for a nominal fee, like what you're doing in Africa. So for a handful of dollars, a child can get an education where there is no education. But it's another thing where, in a country like the US, where getting your child waitlisted on the best kindergarten or primary school available has become equally to getting them into Harvard. And the measure of success has become that of which primary school or kindergarten you get accepted to, because just that's going to set you on the right path or the wrong path for life. So that disparity, please.
So I guess I'd start by first sort of digging into when you say where there are no schools. In the vast majority of the world, even in very poor communities across Africa where we work, there are schools. if you're talking about a school as a building where children attend and there are teachers nominally listed on the board. But if you're saying a school is a place where children are actually learning and seeing outcomes of their learning
and
benefiting from it, then sure, there's a lack of schools across regions of the world where I work, but there's also a lack of schools across regions of the world where everyone here works. And so I think that's an important thing to look at, which is it's not that private schools are acceptable or needed where there are no school buildings. It's that there needs to be choice when there are children that are not learning, whether they are in school, which is the vast majority. The crisis globally about children not learning isn't about children being out of school. Sure, there are some children who are out of school, but the education crisis globally is that children aren't learning despite them being in school. And that is sort of acute in the parts of the world where I work, but it's also the same issue in socioeconomically disadvantaged parts of the world where income levels are very high. And so, it's not a question of private schools should fill in the gap when there are no school buildings. There should be choice for families where their children aren't learning every day despite them going to a building, despite them going to a place they call school. In the parts of the world, in Kenya, for example, 47% of instructional time is lost because there are no teachers teaching. That's half the time the children should be in the classroom. They're not learning because there actually isn't even a teacher there. Now, the same statistics don't apply in OECD in terms of teacher absenteeism and neglect, but in terms of outcomes and seeing that children graduate from early childhood or graduate from primary or elementary school with core reading skills, you do still see a massive gap. And so should those families have a choice to say, hey, my children aren't learning despite them going to a school, whether it's funded by the government or not, yes, that is the fundamental sort of question that a few of us have brought up about the need for choice. But it's choice when children aren't learning, not choice when there aren't physical schools.
One last question, accountability.
Question, or do you want me to?
One last question from my side. Accountability, just also following up on what John was saying. Accountability for both the private sector and the public sector, how can it be achieved? Because the moral question, in my opinion, really does hinge on accountability, does hinge on results. How do you give the results regardless of how do you give the results that's needed regardless of private or public or whichever system that you chose? Accountability, how do you achieve that? Is it the same for both? Is it an independent body? Please.
Yeah, it's a very complex question. It brings me back to the question of children not learning. Now, we have a phenomenon, if what I read is correct, when you look at student success in the United States now. All these students arriving from Asia, from China, or from India, coming from poor background, suddenly they arrive and they're getting the best success rate in the United States. Doesn't this indicate, if you want sometimes, if you come from a poor background, you've got motivation. You've got the opportunity before you. You don't want to get poor again. So you're going to work and work and work, even by candlelight. So there is a question of approach, which is, I think we've got to look at the nature and characteristic of the new society, of the benevolent, welfare-oriented society, which United is supposed to be, and find out sometimes our children are not too interested anymore. They become blasé. There's no question of, because already my son, 15 years old, without a penny in his pocket, he's got a credit card, right? So I think the characteristic of our society, that's why it's very difficult to make a pronouncement in terms of global situation when every nation has got their own specificities.
Thank you. Finally, just to wrap up, and since I've been taking score, what is the appropriate role for the private sector in K-12 schooling, start with Geoffrey, but we'll go around the room.
So, I mean, I think that the issues that we're facing are complicated because if a parent wants to spend their own money and pay for their child's education, I think they should be able to buy whatever they can afford, right? And I don't think anyone's going to argue and say, if I have money and I want to send my kid to this school and the school will accept my kid, that there's any challenge with that. It really happens when we're using public dollars, right, to support a school, where I think the issue becomes more complicated. When we're using public dollars, there has to be accountability. And by the way, in the US system, there is very little right now with public dollars. I'm not talking about charter schools, I'm talking about with regular public schools. Part of the issue we're dealing with is a belief system. You have a system where people think if you are poor and impoverished, you simply can't perform up to high standards. People literally believe that. And as a person who spent their life in this business, when in the 50s and 60s, we thought it was race, right? We thought all the teachers are white and they don't believe in these black and brown kids, and that's why you have this huge gap. Well, guess what happens? You replace white teachers with people of color and you don't get any different results. People honestly believe because of the difficulties kids are facing in tough urban and other situations, they can achieve at very high levels. So no one cares. When I say no one cares, these places have been failing kids for decades and no one has done anything about it. The system is run exactly the same way. In a system like that, I believe that you've got to hold people accountable. If you start private schools, I think you have to hold them accountable. But if you have public schools, I think you have to hold them accountable also. And it's one of the big challenges in our country. If you don't believe the kids can do it, then you can't hold anybody accountable because after all, the kids can't do it. Once you say it's not the children's fault, it's the adults' fault, that we've got to do something different, I think the accountability changes. In private schools, I believe if you take public dollars, you don't deliver the goods, I think you ought to be closed. I think the school ought to be closed. I don't think we ought to fund failure. But guess what? I don't think public institutions ought to be able to fail kids either without any accountability. And that's the challenge. The one great thing, I don't care where you are in this debate, the one great thing that I think is happening in the US is there is now a debate. There is now an issue about whether or not these really poor kids can really get a quality education. And some folks say, well, the charter schools don't do it. But at least we're having a debate now where there was no debate for decades in this country. If folks haven't seen the documentary Waiting for Superman, the thing that I thought that was the most interesting about this documentary is that it showed what children and parents, what lengths they'll go to try and get their kids an education. It is the only option they have in their life. And I think when you really look at it that way, you begin to say, well, why are we getting in the way of this thing? And I think that's what's happening. I think in a lot of cases we're getting in the way of people getting the best for their kids.
Thank you. John?
Yeah, I mean, just in terms of the role of private schools, I mean, I don't think anyone is calling for the substitution of the private sector by the public sector. I think that, I mean, for instance, in England, there's a private sector, and the private sector expands or it contracts according to the amount of money that's put into the public education system. What I object to about the private sector is that often private schools are set up as foundations to meet the needs of poor children. And yet, they get out of paying taxes, or they get out of their meeting the needs of poor children commitment by simply having strict tests about admissions, so that actually there are a set of subtle admissions which actually restrict the very people that they were originally founded. So I'm absolutely in favour of private schools actually who do have those founding principles, sticking by them or losing their tax status, basically. That is a massive issue, actually.
I would agree.
Thanks. The issue of accountability is this. In my country, in England, the view of the Secretary of State is that the school inspection system is the only way in which you keep a coherent, systemic approach together. The problem with that is that the inspection system then defines what's taught in schools. That snuffs out innovation. That snuffs out creativity. And my view is that actually accountability is exactly right, but what you need is an accountability system which fosters innovation, which fosters creativity, but is also critical about the fact that actually there may be some schools where there are endemic low expectations. Now, I don't blame teachers for low expectations. What I blame is an education system for teachers, and we don't have a teacher pedagogy, by the way, for professional development. There's no theory of professional development, a theory of pedagogy for teacher learning. That's the role of the education system, and a failing education system is a one that doesn't have a coherent approach to the continuing learning of teachers. And that is a massive issue.
I would agree.
Agreed. Jay, last word.
So I agree on accountability. I think that's the key. And whether you're talking about public or private, there needs to be accountability, but accountability for results, for children actually learning. And when you frame the debate focus on outcomes and accountability and outcomes, then you can start to parse out public versus private, where you're talking about there's public and private financing, and there's public and private provision, and they're not all the same thing. So if you have public financing of and public provision, you need accountability on the public providers. If you have public financing and private provision, you still need accountability on the private providers. I think when you have private financing and private provision, you should still have accountability, but that tends to be driven by the parent side. But in all sort of variants of this, it's about focusing on the accountability to deliver outcomes. And certainly if you're using public dollars, that needs to be driven by the public sector in addition to the parents.
Thank you very much. Any final remarks before I open the floor to
Let me just say this, because I think in the U.S., and luckily I'm a U.S. guy, he has the whole world he has to deal with. I only have to think about the U.S. But in the U.S., there's a real legal debate going on, which I think is important. It started in California, where parents sued the public school system, basically saying our constitutional rights to an education is being denied, and they presented evidence of persistent failure with no change, right? So that they could prove to the courts that if we're guaranteed an education by our Constitution and we're not getting one, then we can sue, and they won the case, right? So now they have a constitutional right to form schools that they think will do a better job. The lawsuit was just filed in New York to do the same thing. It's going to be much harder to actually win that lawsuit. But the judge has just made a decision this weekend saying this lawsuit should go forward. And the point of it is not winning the lawsuit. It is a fundamental right of every nation, in my opinion, to guarantee their children access to a quality education. Countries that fail to do this, I think, are going to be imperiled. And this issue is so important to, I think, our countries, that we should take it seriously, that this issue about how do we bring in the kinds of educational options that allow, in particular, disenfranchised, poor kids, kids who are historically discriminated against, historically haven't, it may be religion, it may be race, it may be sex, that this is so important to the future of our countries that it's worth having the kind of legal battles we're having in the United States, where this questions get elevated to the very essence of whether or not you're violating the constitutional rights of young people by denying them an education. So I think this is the right conversation to have. It is not an easy conversation. There are a lot of things John said I agree with, but in the end, I think that we can't ignore that there has to be some changes in some places if we're going to really make sure our children learn. So I just wanted to make sure that in this debate that we're having, people don't lose the passion that I think we all have. And I know John has passion for quality education for all children. This is not the issue. The issue is, I think, whether or not there are strategies and techniques that are being left on the sidelines, right, as we begin to grapple with how do we provide quality education for all kids.
Thank you very much. And having been to school somewhere very close to Harlem, I have to disagree. Harlem is the world. So. Can I open the floor? Questions, please. Gentlemen.
Yes. My name is Barnett Berry at the Center for Teaching Quality. As you can tell, I'm from the States and from the South, where there are no teacher unions and some of the same problems
exactly.
Around teacher evaluation and accountability exist as you do in New York City, Jeff. In the States, we know that there's more variation inside the world of charters and inside the world of traditionals than between them. I think we're asking the wrong question here. It's not either or, it's and both. And I think Jeff and John began to get at this a bit. I am most interested from the panelists to hear how innovation can spread across and between the sectors. That is what I'm most interested in. So yes, competition can help us, but without collaboration and the sharing of expertise like you see in schools in Shanghai or in Finland, we're not going to get to where we need to go. So how can we get away from the either or and get to the and both?
So Jay, the question of cooperation, collaboration instead of competition, how do we bring innovation to link both sectors? Give it a step.
So I think I'm going to probably sound a bit like a broken record, but it has to start with measuring outcomes, because who knows which innovations are succeeding, whether you're talking about in the private sector or in the public sector, unless you're actually measuring outcomes. We talk about sharing a lot about sharing best practices amongst the teaching profession. The operable word there is best, and we have to be able to know that this practice is working for this group of children, you know, and that it's effectively delivering education results. Once we're able to measure that and, you know, and announce that or publish that, et cetera, then we're able to share. But just the notion of sharing without being able to measure it doesn't get you where you want to be. So to me, it starts fundamentally from agreeing on how are we going to measure outcomes? What is the goal that we are establishing for children, no matter where they start in the sort of incoming spectrum? And once we have that, then we can say, hey, in this classroom, in this school, in this part of the world, we're seeing success. Let's figure out if we can apply that elsewhere. But until we set the goals, and in many countries we have set the goals, but then until we measure outcomes against those, then, you know, the sharing of best practices will still continue to be anecdotal.
Right. So your point of measuring goes to outcome, goes to accountability, goes to a lot of. So until we address that, then there is a big gap fundamentally in both sectors. Sir.
I would just suggest that in addressing these problems, we should recognize that different countries offer very different contexts, culturally and politically, in which to consider these questions. If we take my own country, the United Kingdom, it seems to me that we have very good public education on the supply side, but quite poor attainment, mainly not because of the supply side, but because of the demand side, that a lot of children are not motivated. On the other hand, in Singapore, where the private sector plays a very limited role and the national curriculum is highly prescriptive, very good attainment is achieved. So what's the difference? I think that in some countries, the attitudinal and societal issues that schools face, regardless of how good public provision is, are so great that you actually need very high levels of diversity, innovation and inspiration to even begin to unlock motivation in students. So I think what works in Singapore is not the same as what would work in the UK. It's not right for Pakistan either. I think competition is particularly important where general motivation of the student body is not a given. And that is the case in some countries much more than others.
Thank you. Your Excellency, would you like to comment on this?
Yes, I entirely agree with our gentleman from the United Kingdom. I think one point which we must not overlook when we speak about this general question of education is the fact that education begins at home. So if you have a family which is broken, a family which is under the influence of alcohol or drugs, etc., as opposed to a family which knows where they're going, backed by certain philosophy, like you see the Chinese people of Singapore was, you did with two different setups altogether. There, in my view, lies one of the complexity of addressing all these problems, because education begins at home. You can come from a rich family and go to the best school, But if you are not properly motivated and committed to study, you could still become a failure.
Education.
So can I say one thing on this
Go ahead.
issue? Because I want to follow up what His Excellency said on this. But here's one of the differences, I think, in high-performing systems. So in Harlem, you know, we have a population of very poor young people, long history of failure. We had a visit from folks from Singapore. They wanted to come in. And so when we have this regular visit thing, and I'm talking, and I'm sitting here looking at these folk. I'm like, you're all from Singapore. I have the best schools in the world. What are you doing in Harlem? What did y'all didn't have another place to visit? And y'all thought, so but I'm being serious. So I
told you
asked him,
Harlem is the world.
I asked them after the whole thing was over, I asked them, but for real, why are you here? And you know what they said? Yeah, we know we're the best, but there's a certain part of our population that even we are struggling with, and we are looking for the answer for them. And folks said that this is something you did well. Great systems don't ever just accept that certain kids will not learn. They constantly search out, what are we missing? What is out there in the world that can help us figure out how to help this part of our population? I think failing systems accept certain kids don't learn, and they don't do anything extraordinary to help those kids. So I just want to keep that in mind, that when you begin to look at these places where kids are doing well, families matter, it's absolutely true. But when you look at the educators, there is a fundamental belief that we have to push the envelope to figure out how we help this population of kids that's not working. When that population gets really large, 50, 60, 70%, people believe, you know what, there's nothing you can do with these kids. And I think that that calls for a different set of strategies. I think we don't have all the answers, by the way. I don't have all the answers. I think what happens is we stop asking the questions in certain communities, and we just accept the status quo. And that, I think, we can't afford to do.
Yeah, I just think you're going to have to put up with those visits, really. I think I would prefer to have I prefer to have a bunch of visitors from Singapore or Shanghai than not, actually, because what it does show is that there is an interest in the education system, and actually it's about the elevation, the importance of the elevation. I mean, I saw Tony Blair yesterday with President Kagame, and what it reminded me of a bit, and he leaves me with profound emotions, and I'm not going to get into that, but what I do remember him doing in '97 when he came in was putting education as a #1 priority. And actually the key issue for any country and any performing system is that the government has to make education its top priority. Then you can have the debates. Yeah. Then you can move forward the system. Yeah. But unless the government understands that education is the glue of society, is the social engine, is the economic engine, unless you actually understand that, then education is going to actually fall to bits, and everything else is second order. Everything else is a debate about who can get it, who not, but you're never going to solve that problem. So, I mean, everything that I understand about the best education systems in the world, small or large, and incidentally, I think I'm against cherry picking, as they call it in the trade, picking one system up and then dropping it into another and saying, this is the model you've got to follow. But I think there are lessons that can be learned. But what I do understand about the best performing systems is that they do have a systemic approach. They don't actually leave it to the market. They don't leave it to individual schools to sink, swim, or swing in the wind. They actually do have I mean, I was impressed with New Zealand. We had the International Summit of the Teaching Profession. And incidentally, that hasn't come up yet. The International Summit on the Teaching Profession, the 5th International Summit, will be taking place in Banff this year. It's where ministers and teacher union leaders sit down and work through issues of teacher policy. I mean, when I first started it, I thought I'd died and gone to heaven. As a trade unionist, I thought this is wonderful. But actually, what I got from New Zealand was a highly devolved system, massively devolved, but a government that still cared about the groups of children in its society who were doing badly. And in New Zealand, it's Maori children. And actually, how do you intervene in a highly devolved system? You do have to have a systemic approach. You work with the unions, you work with the academics, you work with the universities, and you have a system initiative to actually try and meet the needs of those kids. That's why I would argue that the market is not a trustworthy implement on its own to actually meet the needs of whole groups of children.
More questions?
Hello. Hi, my name is Chirag. The Middle East is better off in comparison to LEDCs and is dominated by private schools. My question to all of you is that, do you think there's still a need or place for public schools? What difference could they make? And since the governments haven't made efficient breakthroughs yet in providing equal access, what could be done on them?
Jay. That was a difficult one.
Sure. So I can't speak to the specific issues in the Middle East, but I'd say, again, it's not public versus private, right? The government has set up a regulatory system that focuses on what are children supposed to learn no matter where they go to school, and then set up an enabling environment so that public schools and private schools can be successful, and that we can focus on knowing which ones are, shut down the ones that aren't if they're receiving public financing, and enable there to be transparency for the population to know which schools are working and which aren't. That's one of the issues that we haven't talked about, is transparency for parents to know which schools are doing well and which ones aren't. It's great if we have all the innovation and all the financing mechanisms to enable a variety of schools to succeed. But if we're not having transparent information to the people who really matter, the parents and their children, then it doesn't matter that we've done all this stuff on the back end. So I do think that one of the key things, whether we're talking about Middle East or more broadly, is transparency to the community, to the parents in that community as to what schools are working and which ones aren't. Once you have that, then suddenly the parents are back in charge, which no matter what system you're talking about is critical.
Any of the panelists would like to? Yes, please.
Well, I would like to introduce another factor in education provided most often by states, that education is very much tied up to what they call an active manpower policy. Because let's say in a place like Seychelles, what is the value to giving a degree in aviation to one of your citizens when you cannot find him a job in aviation tomorrow? Is it not better for him to become fisherman and allow us to capitalize on our maritime dimension? I think manpower policy is very important. And if I was a young man going in Ghana, for example, what would be my motivation? I much prefer to go and learn how to play football, because there I see there's a real opportunity of, because who are today the acclaimed people in the world, they are the top sportsmen. And maybe perhaps because they come from poor background, some of our people from Africa are top noted, best boxers, best marathon runners, So they must see ahead too. We have this education, where does it lead us to? I think there's nothing more sad when you learn about Europe today, where there are so many graduates, so many MAs, etc., without jobs.
Yes.
Can I just say something about this issue? I would be deeply distressed if there was an undercutting of public support for education. I think that the countries have a responsibility to its citizens to make sure that they have access to quality education, which means they have money to pay for quality education, because you really need those resources. If we start withdrawing public support for education and saying, well, you know what, those who can afford can buy this level and you can only buy that level, I think that would be a disaster in most places around the world. And so I don't want it to sound like there's a suggesting that we should not be supporting public dollars going into education. And I think in lots of places, those dollars are not large enough, and that we're not being conscious of the waste and mismanagement and absolute corruption that happens in lots of systems around education dollars. That does not mean, in my opinion, because a lot of people I know argue that the resources don't matter. Resources absolutely matter. To pay for quality, you're going to have resources to pay for quality, and we know quality teachers, quality administrators are the key to running quality schools. So I don't want there to be any sense that there's a suggestion, at least not from me, that we should not be pushing for adequate public dollars to support education. to me, that system, certainly in the States, will almost always be dominated by what we would consider to be traditional public schools, and lots of them are doing terrific. That's not the issue. The issue to me is we have to guarantee that there are the kinds of opportunities for poor kids who we can demonstrate have not been successful to have an opportunity to be successful. So I just wanted to make those 2 points.
Very good.
Great. Last question. Oh, okay. Then it's not the last question. Introduce yourself.
Iman Ali Jaffal, a school principal from Abu Dhabi Education Council. I'm from United Arab Emirates. My question is, I believe that there is many advantages for the private schools, starting with choosing a certain curriculum for your kids to, for example, if they want to start their studying at United States, let's say, or United Kingdom or any of these countries. But there is also many disadvantages. One of them, I believe, or I feel that in a multicultural country like our country, sometimes they feel they are isolated culturally. They live in a certain moods or a certain culture. So I think that this makes limited the blending for them to be, so to say, useful at the country. So my question to Mr. Kanda, what do you think about that? And how we can solve with more control from the government? Or Thank you.
Thank you. So this issue is one that I think we grapple with throughout the United States. There are lots of places that the customs and culture of the students are so alien from the custom and culture of the teachers that they often have mismatch, and sometimes unintentionally folks are sort of reaching conclusions which I don't think are necessarily the best ones to reach. I think we've got to recognize in these really complicated cultures that it is up to the educators to actually understand, appreciate what that culture is. And where we have seen a force, we force you to join the dominant culture without giving any sort of support to you that we appreciate what your culture is. It's been pretty much a disaster. And so if you look in the States, you see lots of pressure for, so this is early in our history. African Americans were completely excluded from any discussions in America. You couldn't find, there was one person, George Washington Carver was the only African American that was ever mentioned, and it gave people a sense that your contributions were non-existent or they were unimportant to the country, right? That to me is a disaster. It just made kids feel ashamed of themselves and made them feel ashamed of their culture. So there has been a real intention now to really say that this is a multicultural country and we're going to celebrate the accomplishments of folks who are African American or Latino or Asian. I think that that is a place where educators need to lead, right? That we have to be able to go out and say, even if I don't know about this culture, it's my responsibility to actually learn something so I can make sure these young people are growing up understanding I appreciate the differences, which makes them actually stronger and not weaker in their own education. So I think that's an area, by the way, that, and I'm not just talking about the States, I think we struggle with this as educators all over the world, right? And that we've got to continue to push educators to be aware and conscious and sensitive to these cultural differences, and sometimes it's language and culture that we need to be sensitive to, and I think we've got a ways to go in that.
And I think that becomes a lot easier when we are taking teachers and enabling teachers from each local community to be teaching in that community, because then the divide is obviously a lot smaller.
Thank you. With the last question to spare over here. Yes, please.
Get sponsors for them and try to fix them back in school. This is something I'm so passionate about, and I'm so happy to be here. It's been my dream. I followed Global Education and Skills Forum online in 2013, and I was like blown away. So last year I couldn't come, but I'm so happy to be here, and I've learnt a lot from all of you, the global leaders, and because this is my passion. I love young people getting back to school, and I do everything possible. So the next step for me now, as soon as I get home, I'm trying to like set up a school in rural community, because where I am, there are no public schools. So going to school, accessibility is pretty poor. So the children, we see them roaming around, engage in child labor, and there are times they need to go out there, convince the parents, release this child, don't worry, we're going to pay the bills and all of this. So now I read about the Bridge International this year. I got to know about the fantastic job you're doing in Kenya, and I'm so delighted to see you. So my question for you and others that have set up schools, I really would love a mentoring, session. What are the words you have for young people like me who are passionate about bringing about the change? Because we don't have to wait for the government. Sometimes it takes a huge lot of time, and now I don't have all of these resources, but I've learned from coming here that you don't need all of the resources. Sometimes once you're passionate about something, get started, and you could get the community involved in all of that. So I really want to know the challenges you had, and as in how you got started, the later way, and now I know you've blown, you've impacted a lot of people. So I want to know the mentoring advice you have for young people who are passionate to make the change.
Thank you very much. Jay, very quickly, we're running on overtime. I need to announce the score.
So very quickly, I think you said it, which is don't wait, right? Don't wait for there to be, a change. Go and make it yourself. And we're starting in Nigeria this fall, so sure, come and talk to me. We'd love to talk about your work.
Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Just to wrap up, as you've noticed, I stopped keeping score because. It actually doesn't matter which side of the debate you champion. What really matters is that we're here together today, and there's so many questions that we couldn't take, so many questions left unanswered. But the fact that we are having this debate, that we are talking about a lot of things that would have made Adam Smith so proud, like competition, supply and demand, and accountability and equity and equality, that's the more important thing. And as long as the debate goes on, and as long as we try to find answers that suit every community, every country, because there's no one answer that fits all, that's the right approach. So please join me in thanking our very distinguished panel for their time today.